Good afternoon again, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Just Business once again. Today we're going to be going over stimulus checks. What do they mean? Why does the government give you this money? The purpose of today's video isn't political in nature. This is just simply an explanation of why the government would give such a check to the population. Hopefully you can walk away from this video with a better understanding of why the government would issue stimulus checks and some of the implications that it may have on the economy as well. So that's my hope for today. Before we get started, as always, if you could subscribe to my channel, I'd appreciate it. Also, please feel free to give this video a thumbs up. That way we can ensure that these videos are actually reaching population and maybe giving somebody an explanation of sometimes difficult terms and concepts to understand. So give it a thumbs up and let's get started. So a stimulus check, exactly what is this? Well, we all know it's money the government gives to the population, but why do they do this? Is it because everybody's in dire need of money, because everybody's lost their job, because people can't pay for food or for rent or for electricity? Well, that's not exactly why the government issues stimulus checks. And in order to understand exactly why the government issues stimulus checks, you have to understand an important term, and that is fiscal policy. Now, I know we've touched on this in previous videos. Well, fiscal policy is essentially a tool the government uses to influence the economy one way or another, right? So they could do this through additional spending or taxation, okay? Now, a stimulus check is a form of government spending. Now, when government spends money, this is known as expansionary fiscal policy. The goal of expansionary policy is to increase consumption within the GDP to influence the economy positively. So the whole point is to increase consumption, increase GDP, and essentially keep the country out of a depression or a recession. It's essentially what expansionary fiscal policy is, and that's what a stimulus check is. Now, to go into that a little bit further, the government issues you these checks with the hope that you will contribute to the consumption aspect of GDP, meaning you go out and buy something, you invest that money back into the economy, right? That's the whole point of this. Right? Now, of course, I also did touch on another aspect of expansionary policy, and that is lowering taxes. The government can also lower taxes to influence increased spending within the economy. That also raises GDP as well. But back to the stimulus checks. The stimulus check is essentially, again, just a form of expansionary fiscal policy. Essentially, if the government is issuing you a check for either $600 or $2,000, it doesn't necessarily matter. Their hope is that you're going to increase the consumption aspect of GDP, thus preventing recession in the economy. A lot of people get confused saying, well, if the government's spending $2,000 per person, well, that's billions of dollars, that's going to increase the budget deficit and so forth. Well, not necessarily. Not if it works the way they want it to. Of course, there are drawbacks to it. People don't always go out and do exactly what the government is wanting them to do, and that is to buy and increase consumption. That doesn't always happen, and if that's the case, then you will have a budget deficit, and there will essentially be no change in GDP, which will do exactly the opposite of what the government had intended when they passed that fiscal policy and issued those stimulus checks. This did occur back during the Great Recession around 2008. The government had issued refunds to the population with the hopes that they would go out and increase consumption and contribute to the GDP. Unfortunately, this didn't happen, and GDP actually declined. So as you can see, and as history tells you, this isn't always necessarily a good thing. So if the government issues you a check for $600 or even $2,000 and you don't use that for anything, well, you're not contributing to the GDP, therefore the government's out money. And that's not necessarily what they want. Now, on the other hand, you also have contractionary fiscal policy, which is essentially the exact opposite. Sometimes there are situations where the government wants to slow down the economy. Perhaps its GDP is rising too quickly. This can lead to inflation, prices going up, things of that nature. So occasionally the government will want to enact what's called a contractionary fiscal policy, which is essentially a decreasing government spending or increasing taxes. So a lot of the times when you hear about taxes being increased, well, that's essentially a form of contractionary fiscal policy, and that could negatively impact an economy, particularly an economy which may be already suffering from a recession or some other economic downturn. So those are just a couple terms to remember. Now, expansionary fiscal policy, such as a stimulus check, can have very powerful effects in the short run. When looking at a graph, this would be sort of labeled as short-run aggregate supply, and you also have a long-run aggregate supply. Now, this can be a very confusing topic, and it's something that we can definitely go over in future lessons, because I think it requires its own lesson to really be able to ascertain the whole aspect of short and long run aggregate supply. But we'll get there, don't worry. For now, just understand that a stimulus check can have tremendous benefits in the short run. However, it's not necessarily effective in the long run, and this will make more sense later in future videos. Now, as stated before, expansionary fiscal policy, such as a stimulus check, can have very negative effects on an economy, even in the short run. Like I stated before, if you don't do what the government had intended by contributing to the GDP with your stimulus check, well, then the government's out of money. Government spending essentially outweighs private spending. And this is something called crowding out. And this is a huge problem with expansionary fiscal policy. Essentially, what that means is just the government has spent money, i.e. on a stimulus check for you, and you don't contribute to the private market, by going out and contributing to the GDP. This can have very negative effects and increase the budget deficit and overall national debt. So that's definitely something to consider and to keep in mind when you're considering your stimulus check. Now, again, there's a lot that goes into this, and definitely something we can bring up more in future videos down the road. Alright, so in summation, essentially your stimulus check is just a form of expansionary fiscal policy enacted by the government to influence the economy, to increase consumption, thus increasing GDP, and bringing the country out of a possible recession or economic downturn. That's going to be it for today. I hope that you walk away with a better understanding of not only your stimulus check, but of the implications that it can have on an economy. Hopefully you understand what fiscal policy is, expansionary and contractionary. Always feel free to leave a comment down below if any aspect of this doesn't make sense or you need additional clarification. I'm definitely here for any questions that may need to be answered. So that's going to be it for today. I hope this was educational and instructional to some degree. I hope you have a great weekend and happy holidays. Until next time, remember, it's just business, and I'll see you later.